Computer. Thank you, and welcome everybody to John Blewitt, who's going to talk to us today about the politics of work and hope. Over to you, John, and please introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hello. Well, you know my name. I should first of all say thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. Um, Most of my working life was spent in higher education or further and higher education, and my last job was in a business school where I was in uh, a work group called Human Resources. So it actually took me back to where I started, and I'll talk a bit about that uh, in a moment. Oh dear, I can't move it on. Oh, yes, we can. I started preparing this presentation a month or two ago when British Steel at Scunthorpe was in the news. May remember that there was a scare that the Chinese owners of the Scunthorpe Steel Works would close the works themselves and let the blast furnaces go cold. And that would mean really the last, I think, steel making facility in the UK would have closed. What the government did, you may remember, was take responsibility for the running of the steel works, getting in coal to keep the blast furnaces going, because if they stop and go cold, it's incredibly difficult to get them going again, and with the older ones, almost impossible. And at this time, April 2025, the Green Party spoke about the need to take British Steel into public ownership again. Um, to talk, and they spoke about making that transition from coal-fired blast furnaces to electric arcs. They spoke about producing green steel, and steel in many ways is a recyclable material. Well, the government did take over responsibility for the running of the works, but it's still owned by the Chinese, which leads me on to the beginning. My own doctoral research a long, long time ago, starting in 1979, was on the British Steel Corporation in Wales. And this is my photograph from the time of the Port Talbot Steelworks. What's interesting then is that there was a debate about whether or not the British Steel Corporation should remain in public ownership or be privatized and go into the private sector. There was a debate about where the coal would come from, and there was a debate about economic efficiency and industrial efficiency, which at that time meant really shedding labour. And in 1981, 7,000 men and women, mainly men, lost their jobs in 3 months, in the first quarter of 1981. So we have, in a way, going back full circle. It was at this time that the new Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher was looking to close a lot of Britain's heavy industry, the shipbuilding, the mines, and the steelworks. So it was either Port Talbot or Llanfairn, which would be closed in Wales. Aberfile and Shotton had been closed earlier. The Scunthorpe Works was put up to question was had a big question mark over it. Consett closed, Ravenscraig closed in Scotland. We lost a lot of our steel making capacity that at this time, and as a result of that, a lot of communities and a lot of people lost their work. When I was in South Wales, talking with the men and women who work there, I asked a lot of questions about the nature of work, what they felt about the closure and economic efficiency, and the uh, possible move into the private sector. And what I found is that a lot of people really just work there in a transactional way. They worked for money. That might seem a bit obvious, but there's also a sense that certainly in the literature I read at the time, that the steel worker was one of those industrial workers who took pride in his work, who had skills and had a commitment to the nature of the task he was undertaking. Didn't come, I didn't find that at all. But what you do find in the post-war world, certainly from about 1945 onwards, and you can see this in some of the promotional films produced. This is from 1945 at the time. There was almost a romance about heavy industry, a romance about the production process, the nature of the work, uh, the beauty, in fact, of the industrial machinery. None of this, again, I, I came across. Although, having said that, what was really important to the people I spoke with at the time was the community which surrounded the steelworks. Said 7,000 men were made redundant. There were about 13,000 men employed at that time. And there were all sorts of other organizations and businesses supplying the steelworks. So, if not an occupational community, there was a work-based community in that area. With, with the steelworks gone, the community fragmented. The meaning of the work was the convivial nature of the outside community. And a couple of years ago, the Port Talbot Steelworks were again in the news. What would happen to the Port Talbot Steelworks? Would it close? Well, it wouldn't close, um, but it was no longer producing steel. So a lot more jobs were lost, leaving really just a skeleton workforce there. What Tata Steel said, and Tata, if you probably, as you probably know, is an Indian-based company, said that they would reintroduce steel making in the very near future, and do so in a way which would not only create more jobs, more jobs, more jobs, but would also be far more sustainable. They would bring in electric arc furnaces so that Tata Steel would, if not be net zero in Port Talbot, then it would certainly be close to it. Um, at the very same time, interestingly enough, the same company was building the largest coal-fired blast furnace in the world at its site in India. So you've got to take a lot of the discussions and arguments and PR with a pinch of salt. There's no sign, I believe, of the arc furnaces wending their way at this moment to Port Talbot. So, this leads me on to this discussion of green and decent jobs. Goal 8 of the Sustainable Development Goals is decent work and economic growth. Decent work is often linked with green jobs, but both of these, according to the Sustainable Development Goals, is predicated on the need for continuing economic growth. And it's interesting to look at the various definitions of green and decent jobs, because they do vary quite considerably. The United Nations defines green jobs as those that contribute appreciably to maintaining or restoring environmental quality and avoiding future damage to the Earth's ecosystems. The International Labour Organization refers to green jobs or people working in green occupations as workers whose duties involve making their establishment's production processes more environmentally friendly or more efficient in their use of natural resources, which means you can work in a dirty industry so long as what you're doing is trying to make it greener. And decent work is defined by the United Nations as basically opportunities for men and women to obtain productive work, which is decent, in terms of its social benefits, its equity, its security, and the fact it provides the worker with some form of human dignity. And the European Union has its own Green Deal and its own take on green and decent jobs. The EU's industrial strategy is to harness the significant potential in global markets for low-emission technologies, sustainable products and services, which will require the full mobilization of industry, including all industrial value chains and energy-intensive sectors. The EU has produced a classification of skills for a transition to a green economy, and there are apparently 381 skills, 185 knowledge concepts, 5 transversal skills, and these are all broken down further. So it's an amazing exercise in defining what job skills are. But absent from all that, I find, is a number of things. Firstly, is actually what does the job mean to the people doing it? How significant is it apart from the fact that people need work in order to earn some money? How important is it in their lives? A lot of people work simply for money, and a lot of people have to work in pretty awful conditions without any form of social protection. In 2023, over 2 billion workers, or 58% of the global workforce, were working in the informal economy. And that was, and the information there can be found in the UN's own 2024 assessment of the achievement or non-achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. So there's a great deal of informal work, part-time, dangerous, difficult, unsatisfactory in many ways. In India's huge garment industry, there are conditions of, I've got neo-bondage twice, neo-bondage, patriarchal unfreedom. Labour is cheap. And if labour is cheap, then the products they produce will be cheap too, as a lot of people will find when they go shopping in high streets in this country, in the United States. Neo-bondage is not quite modern slavery. A lot of people get into debt, first of all, by taking a sub at the beginning of their work, and therefore are remain financially indebted to their employer continuously at the start of their work, their contract, and at the end. And a lot of low-caste workers have not only this to deal with, but also the stigma of being low caste themselves. Many of these workers will travel the length and breadth of the state they're in, or even India itself, for work. They're peripatetic. But certain areas in the world, and Cambodia's building industry is one of them, is is full of people whose experience of work is little more than awful. Uh, Not so much neo-bondage, but bonded workers, experiencing pollution and ill health as a result. Now, when in the 80s, Britain moved away from its heavy industry towards a service economy, uh, the increasingly digital technology was being seen as a way of dematerializing the economy and making production and the financial services particularly far more efficient. So in the global north, if we have an area where uh, this type of informal labor, this type of neo bondage, if you will, this type of hard work and relatively poorly recompensed exists, it's within the field of digital technology. Amazon warehouses are often seen on the front line. And so is the production of smart technologies. And for example, the laptop I'm using at the moment, Foxconn in China. There was quite a Foxconn was in the news some years ago because of the conditions were so appalling that there were a number of suicides in 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 this Chinese company, which made products for the Apple company. The gig economy is something too, which is highly pressured. And although there is some resistance, it's often something. It's often an area where those working in it have few benefits and few ways of improving their conditions of employment. Another aspect of the digital technology, which is creating work, certainly, but creating pretty difficult work, those people involved in content moderation, often in the global south, but not exclusively. And these are the people who have to sift through images, video content, of all sorts of awful things, rape, suicides, terrorism, mutilation, you name it. And there's a great deal of mental and physical ill health resulting from working in that field. And about 20 million people work in the gig economy doing this type of stuff. Some of it has been taken over by algorithms now, But for those algorithms to work, there's got to be people doing the labeling in the first place to recognize what the images are. So this is all part of our world. It certainly is the world of the global north and increasingly the affluent classes in the developing south. And a few years ago, the New Economics Foundation, which is part of the Schumacher Circle, I believe, looked at work and its value. Then in 2009, this was just after the financial crash, you remember, uh, said a leading City of London banker may enjoy a salary of between 500,000 and 10 million pounds, but they destroy £7 of social value for every pound in value they generate. Likewise, a top advertising executive may destroy £11 of value for every pound in value they generate while receiving a salary between £50,000 and 12 million. In contrast, childcare workers between £7 and £9.50 and hospital cleaners over £10 worth of benefits to society for every £1 they are paid. I didn't read that very well, but they actually produce more benefit to society than they actually are paid. So the status of that work, the financial compensation which they receive, are certainly uh, by no means equal. And whether these people find their work fascinating, meaningful, or in other ways life enhancing is something else. So the Institute of uh, uh, Management and other organisations in Britain noted, first of all, that UK workers, as well as workers in Europe and elsewhere, actually work long hours. 94% of all UK workers work more than their contracted hours. And 65% of those feel they're obliged to work more hours. There's also a belief that work labour should become as efficient as possible. And you will know most probably about Frederick Taylor and the time and motion studies. This was some of the films from the early part of the 20th century looking at how to make work more efficient. And that still goes on. Productivity, or one of the measures of productivity, is production per labour unit. And it refers to not just the manual work at this time, but also clerical work too. This type of work, which in the 19th century often was referred to as a treadmill of production, is deeply unsatisfying for many, which leads many people in these jobs to try and find time for themselves, time in which their space at work and their working life could actually provide some meaning, some comfort, some actually resonance with them as human beings. And this picture of a banana refers to an American study in the 1950s by a bloke called Donald Roy called Banana Time. And he studied men working on the assembly line. And every now and again, there'd be a problem with the assembly line, unaccountably. And the men would then be able to go off and have their banana. There would be banana time. This worker-induced stoppage was a way in which workers resisted their time to create some type of cultural space for themselves, some time in which what they do had actually some meaning and importance to them beyond that the simple transaction of exchanging their capacity to labor for wages. So the Institute of Personnel Development noted that less than half of people in this country feel inspired by their work, and 1/4 feel it's actually detrimental to their physical and mental health. Again, just under 50% of people nearly always, or, sometimes 41% of people felt enthusiastic about their job, but interestingly, 20%, a fifth, felt miserable and lonely. And relating to that, the late David Graeber, I think it was his last book or the last book, one book he produced called Bullshit Jobs. That work is really important. He found that a lot of people felt that their jobs were actually meaningless. They couldn't see what the point was in doing it. Uh, they just felt sort of at a total loss of what they were doing. And I can remember when in my last job in a business school, having to do things which seemed to me completely pointless. I remember, for example, having to write a strategy plan uh, for for a course which was closing down at the end of the year, and I couldn't see the point in it, but I had to do it, and the question I had to fill in was, I think, over 30 pages. There you go. But bullshit jobs don't actually equal shit jobs. There are some pretty awful jobs, necessary jobs, um, which do have meaning, necessary social meaning, which might be very difficult. And it might be, the care worker, or or traditionally it was somebody, who worked in the sewage industry. These industries, these works are difficult. Uh, they're not built, they're socially necessary, um, but they're not meaningless. They do have a great social value. Interestingly, too, the Institute of Environmental Managers uh, had a survey conducted 2 or 3 years ago, and they noted that those certainly professionals who undertook some training uh, in environmental management goals and related subjects uh, often felt a greater degree of job satisfaction than those who didn't. Though this did not necessarily translate into career progression. Also, interestingly, they found that a lot of green industries are also subject not just to global competition, but also subject to this dominant condition for many workers of fluctuating pay, job precarity. And this is leading to, certainly in the United States, large efforts to unionize um, short contract workers in the new green industries on the new frontier green economy. And the same is going on in the global south too. So I think part of any transition to a green society and to a greener economy will inevitably have to include meaningful work for people and the production of meaningful products, meaningful stuff. And that leads me on to another thing. In considering this, we need to actually think very carefully about what this meaning means. And for me, not least because of my interest and association with all things to do with William Morris, it's related to the nature of work itself and the nature of production and its effects on the environment and its effect on human society and human community. Wealth is what nature gives us, and we need to preserve and enhance that and not destroy it. Famously, this was 1886. He wrote a book about useful work versus useless toil, meaningful work versus bullshit jobs. And although I'm not arguing or going to argue that what we need to move towards exclusively is craft production, what is interesting if you look at craft production is that a lot of people do gain a great deal of satisfaction and meaning from their work in producing things themselves, not just by hand, but by using machinery too. And that's pure Morris. And what's interesting about craft is that it does take time. It challenges the notion that time is money. It challenges the belief that economic efficiency and workplace efficiency are the be-all and end-alls of production. If we want to live in a world which is not characterized by the social acceleration we've been experiencing over the last 40 or so more years, then we need to recalibrate our production processes and our notion of work. Well, Glenn Adamson, who's a writer and a curator, he worked at the V&A and he works in the United States, talks about is that craft enables us to create a material intelligence. It enables us to understand the world about us because craft puts us in touch with the nature of materials. It's something tangible. It's something which we can feel and touch and we can think about seriously. It creates a type of resonance within us and with the world. And so does repair workshops, of which there are more and more in most countries. One problem at the moment for us is that in our highly industrialized society, mass production, a lot of goods are produced which are eminently disposable. They don't last very long, and you can't fix them when they do go wrong. In fact, if you did try it, it would take you a great deal of time and probably cost you more money, and you might not even succeed. So there needs to be integrated into product design a sense of a belief that these materials can be, a lot of goods can be repaired, can have an extended lifespan. And this can be achieved in a number of ways. Digitization enables us to do that by producing certain component parts with 3D printing. craftspeople are using their own materials, and the barriers between modern digital technologies like 3D printing and craft work and design are actually now blurring. So I'm not talking about in recalibrating work and production going back to the 19th century. I'm talking about making stuff in a meaningful way which can be repaired and with an extended life. And that, in some ways, will lead us to think about the look of things. Stuart Walker, who's professor of design at Manchester Metropolitan University, says that one of the things we need to challenge is this glossy modernist look, this shiny look of the iPhone or the Airbook, which you can't take apart and you can't mend. Uh, that is so damn sexy. The very look of it is attractive. And that also features in a number for a number of other products too. So, with meaningful work and meaningful stuff comes meaningful and sustainable workplaces, meaningful and sustainable design. Sustainable design can include building construction, of which a lot of craft-based activities are can be can still be prevalent and sustainable. There is a notion too that a lot of designed goods and services and other things can be designed not just by professional designers, but by professional designers and others, including users. Design itself can be shared, and that sharing is actually sharing the nature of both creative and productive work. And I've been talking about meaningful stuff. There is a sense, there is a belief that there are there's the deep and the shallows of material culture. Disposable society produces a lot of stuff which comes in and out of our lives fairly quickly. But what is actually deep and meaningful to us, whatever it may be, we stick with over a long period of time. That sticking with could be because the good is both useful and beautiful. As Morris talked about, that goods need to be durable, that you would want to stick with them because they were good, because they were serviceable. Get a new phone every year. Interestingly, the Dutch company Fairphone is producing a phone which lasts about 10 years. You can update it. It's only been around for 10 years. No, 12 years, I think. But that is often, the Fairphone company is often seen as sort of a high-tech company, which is putting a lot of these ideas into practice. So deep and meaningful products, deep and meaningful work, deep and meaningful design goes back many, not just decades, but thousands of years to ancient civilizations. And this is an interesting image, I think, from Mesopotamia. It could almost be an Apple Watch, an iWatch, and a small bag to put your product in. And finally, I just want to say that if we're able to do this somehow, and if we're able to create a different type of relationship to our work, to what we produce, and to other people, which do a lot of who do the same thing, then we are creating a sense of resonance and emotional investment in a different type of world. Um, and it's this resonance which Morris was on about, and which a lot of thinkers and a lot of designers are trying to capture in their work, and a lot of sustainability practitioners are trying to promote in their talks and writings. And finally, towards the end of his life, Morris said, "Well, I've been so lucky. Uh, my work is simple enough. It's pleasant. Uh, you know, Anybody really with a decent amount of intelligence can do it. I would not want to do anything else. This is what is important to me, is a pleasure to me. Under no circumstances would I give it up, even if I could." And I'm afraid that for many people, that is not their experience of work. And for many organizations and for many institutions, international, ILO, business, government, or whatever, they're not talking about this. They're not talking about meaningful work and meaningful stuff. They're still, even though they talk about decent and green jobs and economic growth, what is missing is actually looking at the nature of work as a significant, important, and enhancing life activity. And well, I've said finally already, but this is an image from 1935. It's from the film Coalface. The miners, again, often spoke of the harder nature of their work, but were often proud of what they were doing because it had social meaning, because there was a community attached to it. And although they suffered a great deal in terms of industrial ill health, an occupational hazard, and the industry is now more or less gone in many parts of the world, though obviously not in Australia or India or the United States, it's something to think about. If we move to a greener economy and greener society, we have to retain some of the good things which we have lost within at least certain heavy industries. Thank you.
Gosh, thank you, John. Indeed, that was brilliant, and I just love the images that you've given us today. Um, Thank you for that. And if it's okay, I shall ask
Mm.
people to raise their hands for any questions at all. John, if you could stop sharing your screen,
Oh, am I? Oh, right. Okay.
I think that's still your screen, the three fishes.
Good. No, right. Get rid of it. So how do I do this? Stop sharing? Have I stopped sharing?
Stop
Stop.
sharing. Yep, lovely.
Ah, that should be it.
That's it. Yes, lovely. Thank you. So we got everybody there now, and yeah, so and absolutely fascinating, and I just love this sort of way that you've explained that sort of the historical pictures and the patterns that are emerging in work, and it makes you think very hard. How can we reshape things? How do we make the change that you're talking about actually happen? But anyway, I'll leave that to other people to ask questions. So please, if you have a question for John, please.
And also for other people to come up with the answers.
Oh, yeah, yes, yeah, thank you. Yeah, that would be, yeah, we're very good at asking questions, aren't we?
Yes.
Thanks. Anybody's got any comments or questions, please? Any- Anybody? Right. There we go. Dennis, I thought you would.
Yeah. I just think, I mean, I loved your talk, John, and it was just very enjoyable to listen to as well and nicely structured. So thank you. Uh, Um, I just think that it would be really great to do to link up these themes with the well-being economy movement. I mean, obviously there are many different strands of new economy thinking and people trying to sort of frame what an economy could be differently. And you mentioned degrowth, and I was going to ask you to talk a little bit more about that. But I mean, for my money, the Wellbeing Economy Alliance is doing a pretty good job in the cultural sphere of sort of changing hearts and minds about what the economy ought to be doing. Um, Perhaps less organized, perhaps a less good job in terms of strategies and whatever, but at least the governments are sharing strategies. And strategies for meaningful work seems to me something that would be really worthwhile um, considering in more detail. Obviously, and I'd just like to ask you off the top of your head, or if you've thought about, you've sort of covered quite a lot of what meaningful work contributes to well-being, but I guess that could be done more systematically as well to link it to, for example, Welsh government's um, indicators for well-being, for example. You know what I mean? It could be worked on a bit more. Anyway, just to as a footnote, yeah. So I'd like to ask you that and a bit more about degrowth,
Hmm.
perhaps, but also, yeah, just to mention that at the Wellbeing Economy Conference in Iceland, we talked about the need to have some kind of network of people who are producing sort of philosophical and normative political thought linked to the well-being economy, or like in Adam Smith and other foundational kind of economists have had moral and ethical and philosophical work linked to economics. So that's something that I think would this debate could contribute to. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed that.
Right. Well, yes. At least where the global north is concerned, but probably also for the more affluent classes in the global south too. Degrowth is about, it's an invitation for people to think very carefully about what they gain satisfaction from, both in their work and in the products they consume and services they consume and later dispose of. This idea that a lot of these things that we have come in our lives and go out is well known. But what's also important, and sometimes it's forgot, sometimes it's not really discussed, is that a lot of people's sort of identity is actually produced by what they own, what they display. And it's that type of sort of instant meaning or significance which they are able to achieve through the continuous consumption, continuous possession. So degrowth invites people to think differently about what actually gives them a great deal of satisfaction, what is most important in their life. And this is this notion of between, the deep and the shallows. I think that's important too. I think the other aspect of the degrowth discourse, which is worth considering, is this emphasis on care work, and caring about what you're doing, caring about other people, caring about yourself, and caring about the planet. Now, initially, this notion of related to the types of work traditionally undertaken by women in the global north. It was women in the household who enabled the breadwinner to go out and work every day. That caring work was unrecognized, or probably at the very most under-recognized. But care is significant too. And my feeling is that if we care about what we're doing and why we're doing it and the effects on each other more, and are able to express and communicate that care to others through our words and actions, then we are, on the way to creating a society which is both socially and environmentally sustainable. So that's roughly where I want to be. But I would also say that, again, historically, and I still think this is the case for many people, work is tremendously important, or it can be tremendously important beyond that transactional relationship of time for money.
Yeah. Thank you, John. I think that's a really important point with that sort of identity that people have. Their work becomes themselves, and that is, how they define themselves in the world. So we mustn't lose sight of that need that people have to build identity. Anyway, yep. Paul, thanks.
Oh yeah. Really enjoyed the talk, actually. I've just retired from 50 odd years in industry printing, and I think there's also gratification from work, and the value of a job well done, which I see lost these days. A lot of the younger generation do not. They just It's a throwaway society. They don't value anything. I still use a cast iron frying pan that my grandparents had, and that's lasted the test of time. But yes, it's instilling that sense of value and looking at your needs rather than your wants. And I think that's a very important point.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's probably very hard to find satisfaction in some jobs.
Hmm.
Some of these jobs in the informal economy are often seen as providing flexibility, but often only works one way.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Paul. Uh, Julian.
Thank you, John. Really great to have that overview. You plugged my profession. You talked about sewage workers, and I don't know if I'm the only one present, and I wasn't sure if you were being a bit disparaging about us sewage workers.
No, not in the least.
Well, I don't know. Yeah, as usual, too much to say. We've got this process, well, sitting in the wings. It was something actually that what is it? Patrick Holden's crowd, the sustainable farming people came up with. I had a role in lobbying for it, and I also had a role in looking at this for Thames Water in 2013. True cost accounting. This is to do with the way capitalist processes in the land have a habit, as they do in many other processes. And this is my question, because I can't believe this isn't a methodology that isn't being applied elsewhere. Although, as I say, it's being very poorly applied in farming and water management. The way capitalism externalizes its costs, it socializes its costs. I mean, it's effing outrageous, frankly. Is this a process which can be applied to industry and other economic processes? Have I made that clear, or do I need to explain it further?
Um, could you just sort of sum it up a little bit?
Yeah, we have huge problems with mismanagement of our land. Our landscapes have been a subject of exploitation by our elites, probably since civilization began. Latterly, we had the enclosures and the clearances that threw people off the land. They were replaced by ever more damaging technologies. The damage caused by those technologies is never accounted for. And true cost accounting is a way of accounting for those costs. And as I say, it's sitting there gathering dust. There's a great book by Routledge of that title that Patrick Holden's work was able to get underway, but it's just not being applied. And I just wondered if there was a similar way of accounting for all these other costs in all our other economic processes. I'm an agriculturalist as well as a sewage worker, so to me it's crystal clear. And incidentally, we can produce a constant growth economy out of our renewable resources because they're always being renewed. And furthermore, they are the most socially equitable means of spreading wealth. Of course, we're a million miles away from that in certain ways due to my colleagues' failures in getting these messages across. But I mean, we're up against brutish and massive vested interests trying to stop this message getting across. So to reiterate, we've got these externalized costs as a result of capitalist exploitation of our landscapes. I mean, the simplest is, degradation of soil through chemical usage, causing flood, drought, and raised temperatures. It's not properly accounted for in climate modeling, for example. It's not properly accounted for in terms of damage and costs to communities. 1 in 6 houses at risk from flooding. Is there a similar accounting process that can be applied to industry?
There probably is, and there are probably models out there already.
Yeah.
But I don't have a great deal of knowledge about that. I know that on a much larger scale, on a sort of social or global scale, there's all sorts of models and indexes regarding what activities are most important to people, are most important to the environment and elsewhere. So, I'm sure that's possible, and I'm sure it's probably been done already. And I think, certainly going back to the notion of degrowth, but even amongst some green growth, there's a, there are certain things which shouldn't be done in the first place, and I think we need to stop this, stop doing these things before they, I was going to say, get out of hand. The path dependent pathway or the path dependencies, which are often created once we start things and we get locked into it and we can't get out. And I think we need to stop that. And I think one way of doing that is to carefully consider what type of technologies and what type of activities we need to do in the first place. And that would include modeling all sorts of things. And I still think that a lot of our activity is not done in a way which systems thinkers particularly would like. And I see that a lot when I've been reading about and looking at new housing developments, the effect on the local landscape, the effect again on sewage systems, on transportation, uh, on the purchasing and acquisition of building materials and labour, the social infrastructure, which is going to be stressed to the limit or beyond, because lots of people will eventually come into these new estates, and there is not the schools, there's not the health service, there's not the other facilities required for them. What happens is that we need to cure, or we need to do something about the housing problem. We need to create economic growth. The best way to do that is build more houses. That's it. That's the type of siloed thinking which, has been talked about now for 25, 30 years, but it's still very much in evidence, I think.
Thank you, John. I mean, to me, that bears out what I'm suggesting. And like you, I don't have sufficient, or as you suggest, I'm unaware of any true cost accounting of these factors. But everything you've just described could have a true costed accounting for it. I'm minded of a conversation with the head of strategy for Gloucestershire County Council quite a few years ago now. But just before he retired, he said to me he commissioned a study into all the assets and infrastructure in Gloucestershire. And he said everything that was built before 1914 had permanent value. Everything built after 1914 had no permanent value. Well, we have a right. This is, at the end of the day, it comes down to regulation of all these processes. In the water sector, well, we all now know there just is no effective regulation. It is gangster capitalism. But, building a wind or a water turbine that only lasts for 20 years, that will barely cover its carbon footprint of putting it in. Give it a 40-year lifetime or a 50-year lifetime. Do you know what? It produces free energy. And if it's owned by the community, on one of our projects, Ogwen in North Wales, they've measured the churn, the turnover in the local economy. For every pound they get back out of their water turbine, it gets multiplied 13 times in the local economy.
Yeah.
Well, do that for farming, water services, energy. You are going to have a constant growth economy because you're just going to be churning and churning and churning that money. And within a decade or two, we'll all be as rich as Arabs.
Yeah, and
I've said enough. I've said enough.
Yeah, I think, again, going back to modern housing, particularly, a lot of modern construction isn't built to last in the same way as it was in previous generations. Maybe 20 or 30 years. A lot of stuff certainly built in the 60s is already gone. But a lot of the new estates have serious structural problems within less than 10 years. And that is largely, I think, as a drive for profit, but it's also it's also often a result of inadequate workmanship and inadequate materials being used, and we can't afford to waste people's lives or to waste people or to waste precious materials.
Yeah. Really important area to work on, that one, John. Thank you. Paul.
Yeah, interesting to hear. I had a friend of mine who worked for a company making wiring harnesses for cars, and the design brief was for it to fail after 12 years. So they would run accelerated life cycles, and if it was 10 years, they would add a couple more strands of wire, or if it was 15, they'd take a couple out to fill the brief. Now, that is just ridiculous sort of situation. And regarding houses, I mean, I know A friend of mine has a house that he bought new, and 25 years later, it is pretty much reached its life expectation, which is, disgusting, really, I think.
Yeah.
The other thing I'd like to raise, this continual growth model, how long do you think it's going to last? I think the way that some of the oligarchs are running the world now, and people are going to start seeing that, uh, I think there might be a counter to that, and people might start challenging. But anyway, I'd be interested to hear what you think.
Well, I think intellectually it's been challenged for quite a while, and it's certainly been challenged since the degrowth movement got underway over 10 years ago. But I also think that the drive for continual growth, which is often married to deregulation and poor working conditions and flexibility is or is already leading to sort of social and political problems, which, when combined with the environmental problems with climate change and resource extraction is going to lead to is leading to serious problems already, political problems. People are getting dissatisfied with the political process because it's not delivering us the sense of well-being or security which people need and want. It's not creating the conditions where their lives can be meaningful in any serious way, but it's a continuous process of moving from one job to another. And then, of course, once you're physically burnt out, what happens after that?
Mm.
So I think we're seeing the social crisis developing at the moment, the political crisis with people going for the easy and glib solutions which the far right are producing, and that is combining with environmental problems and climate change, which is adding to those social and political problems, often in the form of forced migration and so on. So I think that will stop it eventually. And if it doesn't, we're going into the dystopian world which science fiction writers have been so eloquent in producing for many decades now.
Mm. Thank you, John. I think that's something we need to work hard to prevent actually happening, us falling into that dystopian mode. Um, a lot of interesting thoughts being raised. Has anybody else got anything at the moment? I had a sort of a question about whether a universal basic income might actually be some sort of mechanism that could start to shift us towards meaningful work. Any thoughts on that one, John?
Um, I'm not a great fan of universal basic income. Um, and it's largely because it's seen as the cure for everything.
Mm,
Uh, I'm much more interested in universal basic services, what a lot of trade unionists used to call the social wage. You know,
mm,
the benefits we get from free health, education, welfare provision, and so on. Um, that is, I think that's probably where the emphasis is going to be. I think there's a huge sticking point where UBI is concerned is that, you know, how much is it going to be?
yes.
You know, uh,
Mm,
um, and if it's too little, it's pointless. If it's too much, then how is this money going to be generated? I
Mm.
suppose the banks could just do it, but it doesn't seem to be, for me, uh, the universal solution
No.
to a lot of our ills. There's probably a place for it somewhere.
Mm.
Um, Certainly in terms of consolidating certain welfare benefits and providing those people who are unable to work, or for whatever reason, health or age or whatever, with decent income, um,
Mm.
provide food and so on. But for those people too, as well as everybody else, I think we need the access to those social services, which are now fast disappearing, and many of them have gone already.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's worth keeping an eye on the experiments in those areas to see whether they can give us some kind of vague answers to the questions that have arisen today. And as we talked earlier, we're very good at asking the questions about things, aren't we? And
Yeah.
yeah,
Well, I know that a lot of people have said universal basic income will give people the opportunity to turn down work.
mm,
Um, if they don't, if they don't want it, or if it doesn't actually sort of meet
immediately.
their other needs. I can I can understand that,
Mm,
uh, that argument, and there's probably something to that. Um, but I don't know.
no, no.
I'm not convinced.
Well, I think as exploration and the search for meaningful work is something that's an ongoing process. It's going to take a long time to work out, and any transition to that is going to have consequences to think through very carefully. So, if everybody's happy with that, with questions, Julian, another question? Yeah.
If no one else wants to go, and I feared you were about to wrap up.
Hey.
Yeah, just to, let me say I'm totally with John on his response on universal basic income, with that key criteria that those most in need must be looked after, and that is the duty of all of us and all of the state, and and the part of the key purpose of the state. Sorry. And the one thing that strikes me about UBI, which seems grossly unfair, of course, it's only being planned for the people in this country. It's the people suffering, the majority of humanity, who are the ones in the greatest need of universal basic income, and who suffer most terribly because of the deployment of Western corporate interests in their countries. Just the exportation of subsidized food from the West is destroying agricultural economies in so much of the world. My colleague El Habib in Algeria, I mean, he writes so eloquently, and Richard Helen suggested perhaps we could try and get him on for a session here. As he's pointed out, it costs £500 to create sustainable land and water management sufficient to support a family in Algeria, compared to the tens of thousands of pounds we pay for these poor people who are forced to emigrate because they don't have that facility. So it's just a madness upon a madness. And again, some sort of true cost accounting, but is necessary to highlight all of this. The key point I wanted to get in here is, I mentioned the fact that wind and water turbines generally have a 20 or so year lifetime. They're a racket, bluntly. But we, again, we have a right, through our energy, through our water, certainly, to best least cost supply of those services. That's why we have the regulators. Clearly, in the water sector, where I have the most experience, I mean, it's just a madness. When you put all these factors that are not true cost accounted for together, the fact, for example, in Gloucestershire, we have ample renewable energy. Had it been implemented a couple of decades ago with properly engineered technologies, we would be enjoying incredibly low-cost energy right now. So this is what I would call our climate rights. And I think this may be a way of moving forward. This doesn't address the issues in industry directly that John has very eloquently explained, but I think there is a huge area of work in climate rights and yeah, cheap renewable energy and cheap organic food, because chemical food is not cheap. Anyway, I've said my bit.
Thank you, Julian. John, I think you would agree with that, indeed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, at that point, I will wrap up and say I hope you all say a very big thank you to John for a fantastic presentation and some lively discussion as well. John, thank you. Lots of questions and lots of thoughts from what you've given us today. So, look forward to seeing you all again at our next webinar, which we're advertising soon. So it's another one coming very soon. So thank you very much, John, and good evening to everybody. Have a safe time. Thank you.
Bye all. Good to see you again, Julian. Bye.
Cheers, everybody. Thanks, John. Oh, he's gone. Right.